A young man had agreed to marry a 70-year-old millionaire, but the truth about her shocked him. A light bulb flickered dimly in the kitchen, casting long shadows on the cracked linoleum. Richard sat at the table with his hands on his head, staring at the to-do list. The clock on the wall read 5 a.m., and his next day at work had not yet begun. In the next room, his 8-year-old sister Deborah was snoring peacefully, sleeping with the teddy bear that had been her only toy since life had started to fall apart. Richard struggled to get up, threw on an old jacket, and headed for his first job as a loader in a supermarket. He had to finish his shift before 8 a.m. so he could take Deborah to school, then to the cafe where he worked part-time as a waiter, and in the evening as a food delivery boy. His life had long ago become an endless circle. Work, school, taking care of his sister, and work again. The only thing left of the old 22-year-old boy who dreamed of going to university was the tiredness in his eyes. It was cold outside. His shoes needed replacing long ago, but he always saved the extra money for Deborah. His mother had left 4 years ago, taking the family's last savings with her. Richard remembered how she had simply packed up her things, leaving him and his sister alone with a mountain of problems. His father had died the year before, and his mother hadn't been able to bear it. "You're strong, Richard. You'll get through this." She had thrown her goodbye, as if to justify her action. Whether he did, Richard did not know. Every day was like a fight for survival, with everything at stake: food, shelter, Deborah's future. "I have no right to give up," he repeated to himself like a mantra. Deborah was everything to him. Her smile in the morning, her stories about school, and her children's drawings on the fridge were what kept him going. At work, his colleagues sometimes made fun of him. "Hey, Richard, you should get yourself a girlfriend, or you'll be an old man before your time." He only waved them off. What love, when every minute is scheduled. That day, Richard received an unexpected invitation from a colleague. "Listen, there's a charity event tonight. Come along. You'll get free food and maybe meet someone useful." Richard wanted to refuse at first, but the thought that maybe he could find a part-time job there kept him thinking. After gathering his courage, he agreed, not even realizing that this meeting would change his life forever. Deborah woke up earlier than usual. She quietly approached the old desk where Richard was already getting ready for work. His movements were slow but precise. He was carefully folding his work apron into his rucksack, as if he was afraid of waking her. "Richard," his sister's voice came out barely audible. "Are you leaving already?" Richard turned round, trying to smile, though the dark circles under his eyes showed his tiredness. "Good morning, Deborah. What are you doing up so early? You can sleep for another 20 minutes. "No." She shook her head and sat down at the table across from me. There was childlike sincerity in her eyes, as always. "I started a new drawing yesterday. Would you like to see it?" Richard took his hand to the sketchbook, trying to catch a moment of calm. On the pages was a picture of a house with a garden in which a boy and a girl were playing. In the corner, Deborah had signed in large letters, "Our future home." "It's beautiful," Richard said quietly. "It looks like apple trees, like the ones at Grandma's cottage." Deborah looked at her brother with genuine enthusiasm. "Richard, you're going to buy us a house, aren't you?" Richard pretended to think about it, then nodded confidently. "Of course, you know we can do it." He knew that words were worthless without action, but he didn't want to deprive Deborah of her childhood dreams. She was too young to realize the gravity of their situation. The room they lived in was more like a temporary shelter than a home. The windows were blown in by the wind, and the walls were in need of repair. Richard knew his sister noticed it, but she never complained. "Will you come to school for me today?" Deborah asked as she packed her bag. "I don't know, Deborah. I have another shift tonight. But if I can, I'll try. And if I can't, you'll get there on your own, won't you?" "I'll get there," the girl said seriously. "I'm an adult." Richard squeezed her hand. "You know, you're the best. And even if I'm not always around, you have to remember that I'll do anything to make you happy." Deborah smiled and hugged her brother. Richard felt the warmth of her arms and remembered what he makes himself get up for every morning. Her happiness was the only thing that mattered. "I'll be late for my first job," he said, putting on his jacket. "You make breakfast, okay? And don't forget to put your hat on." Deborah nodded gravely as she looked at him. The door closed behind Richard, and she whispered softly to herself, "We'll be happy." The evening was gloomy and windy. Richard was finishing his shift at the cafe, wiping down the last tables before closing. His body ached with fatigue, and his thoughts returned to the list of expenses: rent money, groceries, school supplies for Deborah, and those were just the essentials. "Hey, Richard," came the voice of a coworker named Robert, a jovial bartender who was always ready to cheer up with a joke. "Why are you so glum? Look, I've been given an extra ticket to a charity event. Why don't you go and see if you can relax? They say it's a buffet, so get in while it's free." Richard looked at him in surprise. A charity event? He found it hard to imagine what he was missing there in a world of luxury and wealth. He always felt like an outsider. "Oh, come on, Robert, it's not for me." "Thank you, of course, but I'd rather go home." "Richard, you don't get a chance like this every day." Robert squinted at him slyly. "What if one of the guests offers you a proper job? Or at least you'll get a taste of normal food, not the breadcrumbs you've been lugging from home." Richard wanted to object, but in his heart he realized that Robert was right. He hadn't eaten anything decent for a long time, and the idea of a possible part-time job sounded tempting. Besides, tomorrow was his day off. "Okay," he sighed, accepting the ticket, "but if it's boring, I'll curse you." "There won't be time to curse," Robert laughed. "You won't be bored there. And put on some proper clothes, or they won't understand you in your work jacket." Richard sighed again and hurried home. He opened an old wardrobe, looking through the shelves for something that looked decent. His choice fell on a dark shirt he'd only worn once to his high school graduation. It was still a little big, but it was better than nothing. Before leaving, Richard glanced into Deborah's room. She was sleeping peacefully, cuddled up to her teddy bear, and he felt a rush of tenderness and adjusted her blanket. "Maybe I'm really going for a good reason," he thought as he closed the door behind him. The evening was much larger than he had expected. High ceilings with gilded chandeliers, smart people in expensive suits. It all seemed like another world to Richard. He stood at the entrance, feeling his hands shaking. "What am I doing here?" he muttered to himself before taking the first step inside. The huge hall was full of bright lights, laughter, and ringing voices. People were walking around with glasses of champagne, talking about things that were completely foreign to him. Richard walked over to the far table where the plates of hors d'oeuvres stood and hesitantly reached for a canapé. He hoped to remain unnoticed, but suddenly he felt someone's gaze on him. Turning round, he saw a woman sitting at a corner table. She looked elegant, a simple but impeccably cut dress, her silver hair gathered into a neat bun. Her eyes, piercing but calm, studied him carefully. "Good evening," she said, gesturing for him to come over. "I see this is your first time here." Richard approached her table hesitantly. "Yes, it is," he replied, trying to hide his excitement. "My name is Richard." "Nice to meet you, Richard," the woman smiled. "My name is Barbara. Please have a seat." Who is she? A thought flashed through his mind. The woman rose and gracefully took the glass of water, heading towards him. "Good evening, young man." Her voice was soft but confident. "My name is Barbara. And you are?" "Richard," he replied, shaking her hand. "This is your first time here, isn't it?" she asked with a slight smile. "Yes, a friend invited me just to look," he answered, not knowing what else to say. "Just to see?" she asked, staring at him intently. "That's funny. People come here for other reasons." Richard nodded uncertainly, not knowing what to say. "And what, Richard, brings you here?" she continued, tilting her head slightly. "I don't know honestly," he replied. "Maybe luck. Maybe the hope of finding something new." Barbara squinted, as if assessing his words. "Hope is a wonderful thing, but not everyone can find it in places like this. Sometimes you have to create it yourself." She paused, then added, "I don't often meet people like you here. I see you have character. And something else, honesty, perhaps?" Richard didn't know what to say. He felt awkward under her gaze, but he couldn't look away. "Let me buy you a coffee, Richard," she said, pointing to a table in the corner. "I think we might have an interesting conversation." Richard hesitated, but something in her tone told him it would be wrong to refuse. He nodded and followed her. "What does she want from me?" he thought as he sat down at the table. He didn't know that this evening would change his life forever. Richard sat at the table across from Barbara, feeling out of place. Her calmness, manners, and impeccable appearance emphasized the vast difference between their worlds. But her eyes, there was something more in them, not just interest, but deep wisdom and perhaps hidden pain. She took a sip of coffee, set the cup aside, and spoke. "Richard, you remind me of someone from my past. The same look, determined and tired at the same time. Tell me, what do you do?" Richard hesitated for a moment, but decided to be honest. "I work 3 jobs," he answered, lowering his gaze. "I have to pay the rent, provide for my sister. She's a little girl." Barbara tilted her head slightly. "And your parents?" Richard felt an unpleasant lump in his throat. "My father died. My mother left. I was left in charge." Barbara did not ask any more questions. She listened attentively, and Richard found it strange. Usually people either pitied him or started giving him advice he had heard for a long time. But she just listened, as if she were picking up all the pieces of his story. Finally, she said, "Let me ask you a strange question. Have you ever thought about starting over?" "Starting over?" he interjected, frowning slightly. "No, I don't have that option." She smiled, but there was a mystery in her smile. "What if I told you I could give you that opportunity?" she said suddenly. Richard almost dropped his cup. He looked at her confused, not knowing what to say. "Understand, this is not a joke," she continued. "I'm alone, with no family, no heirs. I need someone I can trust, someone who can carry on my business. But I don't believe in altruism. I need an ally. I need a husband." The words hung in the air. Richard froze, as if he couldn't believe his ears. "Husband?" he asked almost in a whisper. "Yes," she confirmed calmly. "The marriage is formal. It'll give you time to focus on the future instead of fighting for survival. You'll have stability, and I'll have someone to carry on my business." Richard drummed his fingers nervously. Her words sounded like madness on the one hand, but on the other, he could see in her eyes that she meant it. But how could he agree? Could he just sell his life for money like that? "Do you realize how strange this is?" he said at last. "I understand very well," she said with a slight smile. "I'm not asking you to give me an answer right now. Think about it. But remember, opportunities like this don't come twice." Richard didn't know what to say. Her words echoed in his head as he left the room. It seemed to him that the world around him had become even more confusing. It had been a sleepless night. Richard lay on the old sofa and Barbara's words echoed in his head. Taking care of his sister first? He couldn't get any peace out of those words. It seemed to him that he had fallen into a trap. On the one hand, the offer seemed like a chance for salvation, a stability that could give Deborah a normal childhood, a chance to study and dream. On the other, it seemed insane to sell his freedom, his dreams, for a deal he didn't fully understand. What did she see in me? Trying to find the answer in the silence of the room, he remembered that no one had ever looked at him the way Barbara did. She saw something in him that he himself had long since stopped noticing. He got up and walked to Deborah's room. The girl was asleep, hugging her shabby teddy bear. On the bedside table was her sketchbook, in which were drawn bright, almost fairy tale pictures. A big house, a green garden, happy children. Richard was among them. Deborah believed in him. To her, he was a hero who could cope with any difficulties. "Deborah," he whispered softly, adjusting the blanket. "What am I supposed to do?" Richard sat back on the couch, trying to imagine how their lives would change. A permanent home, money for Deborah's education, no more dreading the next rent bill. But could he accept such a gift? And what if this marriage turned out to be another chain, dragging him deeper and deeper into a life he'd never chosen? Suddenly, a moment from the past flashed before his eyes. His father had told him, "A real man is one who is not afraid to make tough decisions for those he loves." Richard clenched his fists. Maybe this was the difficult decision his father was talking about. It was dawning, and he was standing at the window, looking out at the empty street, when a plan matured in his head. He decided to talk to Barbara. He needed to hear the answers to his questions. If he took this step, it would only be to make sure that everything would be right. Gathering his thoughts, Richard pulled out his phone and opened her business card. His fingers trembled as he dialed the number. "Good morning, Barbara," he said, trying to speak calmly. "I'm ready to meet with you. We need to talk things over." The answer was short, but calm. Very well, Richard. Come tonight. I look forward to seeing you. Richard hung up the phone. His fate now depended on this conversation. It was a cold evening, but inside Barbara's mansion it was warm and quiet. The atmosphere seemed almost solemn, even though the wedding ceremony itself was devoid of pageantry. There were only Richard, Barbara, the notary, and a couple of witnesses. No friends, no guests. Richard stood in a strict suit that had been lent to him by one of the employees of Barbara's foundation. The suit was a size too big, but that was the least of his worries right now. He fiddled nervously with his fingers, feeling the unfamiliar heaviness of what was happening. Barbara was wearing an elegant navy blue dress. Her movements remained as confident as the day they met. There was not a shadow of doubt in her eyes, something Richard had missed. "It's your turn, Richard," she said softly as the notary placed the documents in front of him. Richard took the pen and stood still for a second. It seemed to him that his whole life now hung on the tip of that signature. He closed his eyes, remembering Deborah's face, her joyful laughter and dreams of home and garden. Taking a deep breath, he signed it. "Done," the notary said, tucking the papers into his leather briefcase. "Congratulations." Congratulations sounded like a formality. No one clapped their hands. No one cheered. For everyone except Richard and Barbara, it was just a contract. They shook hands as if they had made an important deal, and after the ceremony Richard moved into the mansion. He was given a room on the first floor, a large one overlooking the garden, which even in winter looked well-maintained. A bed with a soft mattress, wardrobes crammed with clothes he would never wear in his normal life. It all seemed unreal. "You'll have to get used to it," Barbara said when he came down for dinner for the first time. "This is your new home and your new world." Getting used to it was harder than he could have imagined. The house staff looked at him with distrust, some whispering behind his back. The manager of the mansion, Tommy, a gaunt man with a stern face, stood out. He met Richard with a cold stare and only nodded dryly when he met him. "We're not used to this kind of change," he said once when Richard was trying to make conversation. "I hope you'll live up to the trust." Richard felt like a stranger in the mansion. The luxurious living, like a canopy over him, reminded him that he was here temporarily. But for Deborah's sake, he was determined to endure. Every evening, sitting in his room, he looked out the window at the quiet garden and repeated to himself, "I'll manage for her sake." The first days in the mansion were like a test of strength for Richard. Too large a space, too soft a bed, too many stairs accompanied him at every turn. He felt as if he had been placed in an alien world where every movement had to be justified. The mansion staff was immaculate but cold. Richard quickly realized that he was considered an outsider here. The manager, Tommy, was particularly strict. His remarks were precise, but always tinged with irony. "Richard," he said one day when Richard was accidentally late for a morning meeting, "punctuality is valued in our house. Perhaps you should set your alarm clock." Richard suppressed his irritation. He knew he didn't need the conflict right now. Instead, he concentrated on Barbara's request that he begin to study the foundation's files. The papers, the reports, the meetings with the staff. It was all new and unfamiliar. It seemed to him that he had entered a maze, the way out of which only experienced players could see. One evening, as Richard sat at a large desk in the library, Barbara found him. She looked tired, but there was interest in her eyes. "How's the work going?" she asked, leaning on the edge of the desk. Richard shrugged honestly. "Slowly. It's all too complicated. I'm not sure I'm up to it." Barbara sat down opposite, looking at him intently. "I can see that you are used to a very different rhythm of life. But remember, Richard, you have every chance to learn. It's not about speed, it's about perseverance." Her words calmed him down a little, but still left him feeling pressurized. He didn't want to let her down, but he was afraid he wasn't doing enough. The next day, the situation became even more complicated. Tommy had arranged for a performance review, and one of his remarks had touched Richard in passing. "If everyone in this house gets lazy, things will soon go wrong," he said. Richard felt the manager's words prickling him. He did not want a conflict, but he realized that he had to prove his place in this world. In the evening, he sat down at his desk with his papers and worked until well into the night. The only way to gain respect was to persevere, and he wasn't going to give up. In the morning, he rose early to meet with Barbara. "I'm ready for a new challenge," he said firmly. Barbara smiled and nodded. Her approval was his first ray of light in this complicated world. The next morning, Richard drove to the office of Barbara's charity for the first time. The building was striking in its austere and refined appearance. Tall windows, massive doors, a bronze sign with the name of the foundation. Inside, it looked even more impressive. Shiny marble floors, paintings on the walls, austere but cozy atmosphere. "This is the centerpiece of the work," Barbara explained as she led Richard into the spacious office. "This is where the projects that help people are born." Richard looked around in disbelief. He couldn't believe that this world had anything to do with him now. In the center of the office stood a massive desk, littered with folders and documents. One of the folders was labeled in gold letters, "Report on Orphan Care. We are involved in various areas: help for orphans, support for poor families, educational grants. But all this requires careful control and a responsible approach," said Barbara Sergeevna. She gestured for Richard to sit down at the table and opened one of the folders. On the pages were charts, figures, and photos of children who had received help from the foundation. They gratefully held textbooks, clothes, or gifts in their hands. "These children have a better life now," she added, looking at Richard. "But without the support of people like you, it wouldn't have happened." "People like me?" he asked in surprise. "I haven't done anything yet." Barbara smiled, her gaze softening. "Not yet, but you will. I see what I need in you: determination and kindness." Richard felt a lump come up in his throat. Her words sounded so sincere that for the first time in a long time, he felt capable of something more. That afternoon, Richard met the staff of the foundation. Some looked at him with distrust, but the senior manager, Helen, a woman in her 40s with a kind face, supported him. "It's not easy here," she said, "but every day brings something good. If there is anything you don't understand, feel free to contact me." In the evening, Richard returned home tired, but for the first time in a long time, he felt satisfied. He looked at the pictures of Deborah on his phone. Her smile reminded him of what he was doing all this for. Before going to bed, he sat by the window, looking out at the evening city, and thought about how much his life had changed. Barbara had given him a chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. It had been a few weeks since Richard had started working at the foundation. He was slowly settling into his new world, learning how to read complex reports, understand budgets, and communicate with donors. It wasn't easy, but every day brought new discoveries. Barbara, watching his progress, gently nudged him to develop. But one day everything changed. That day, Richard returned to the mansion earlier than usual. He wanted to discuss with Barbara the plans for one of the foundation's projects. When he got to the first floor, he noticed that her door was ajar. He wanted to knock, but heard a conversation. "Time is passing faster than I expected," Barbara said tiredly. "You should take care of yourself, Barbara," Tommy replied. His voice was softer than usual. "The medication might prolong it a little." "I don't want to waste time on illusions," she interrupted. "My business is to prepare Richard. He must be ready to take responsibility." Richard froze. The words sounded strange and disturbing. What time were we talking about? He knocked on the door, and the conversation stopped instantly. "Richard," Barbara said, forcing herself to smile. "You're back early. Is everything all right?" "Yes," he answered, trying to hide his anxiety. "I wanted to talk about the project. If you're not busy." She nodded, inviting him in, but Richard couldn't concentrate on the conversation. Her words kept echoing in his head. The next day, he decided to talk to Helen, the fund manager. She had always seemed to him frank and kind. "Helen," he began cautiously, "have you been working with Barbara for a long time? Is she healthy?" The woman froze, her face serious. "Richard, I think you'd better discuss this with her," she said quietly. "But if you want to know the truth—" "No, she's gravely ill. There's not much time left." The words sounded like thunder. Richard felt something turn inside him. Everything was clear now. Her offer, the rush to learn, her look of sadness. She hadn't chosen him just because she saw potential in him. She just wanted to get her business into safe hands in time. That night, Richard sat in his room for a long time. He thought about how much she had accomplished and how he had to honor her trust. His life would never be the same again after he learned of Barbara's illness. His attitude towards her had changed. Now every word she said, every gesture took on a new meaning. He saw in her not only a strict mentor, but also a woman who had survived many trials and still continued to fight for her cause. In the evening, he knocked on her office. She was sitting by the fireplace, wrapped in a warm blanket, reading a book. "Richard," she said with a slight smile. "Is something wrong?" He sat down across from her, trying to find the right words. "I found out about your illness. Why didn't you tell me?" Her face became tense for a second, but then she nodded. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything," she replied calmly. "My illness is a fact, but the future of the foundation is the question. It was important to me that you focus on what really matters." Richard fell silent as he considered her words. Deep down, he felt guilty. While he was adjusting to his new life, she had taken over everything during this time out of last resort. "But why me?" he finally said. "Why not someone from your neighborhood?" Barbara looked at him. Her gaze was deep and soft. "You know, Richard, most of the people I knew saw in me only an opportunity to make money, to gain influence or comfort. You came here with other motives. There's an honesty in you that I've always lacked in those around me." She paused, then added, "You remind me of my son." These words came out of the blue. Richard stared at her, not knowing what to say. She rarely spoke of her family, and he didn't know she had a son. "He was just like you," she continued, "courageous, kind. But life took him too soon. Since then, I've been looking for someone who could carry on not only my business, but his dream as well." Richard felt something click inside him. Her story had touched him to the core. He realized now that he couldn't let her down. He had to justify her trust and do everything he could to keep the foundation going and help people. "I'll do my best," he said firmly. "I promise." Barbara smiled. For the first time in a long time, her gaze was a little warmer, as if she saw Richard not only as a partner, but as someone close to her. As the months passed, Richard was gradually transforming into the person Barbara saw in him. He no longer felt like an outsider in the mansion or the foundation. His days were now packed to the minute. Meetings, project discussions, meetings with sponsors. Although he was still learning, his confidence grew every day. The first serious project he undertook was a program to support young talent from disadvantaged backgrounds. Richard saw this project as particularly important. He saw Deborah and even himself in these children. Every time he looked through the applications, he imagined their authors, their difficulties, and their dreams. "You're beginning to think like a real leader," Barbara once told him as she watched him work. Her voice sounded calm and proud. Despite the changes, Richard never forgot his sister. Deborah continued to be his main motivation. Every evening he called her to see how her day was going and to share his progress. "Richard, are you really an important man now?" Deborah once asked, laughing into the phone. "I don't know how important I am," he replied with a smile, "but I try to do what I can." She didn't know all the details, but she could sense that her brother was changing. His voice became more confident, and there was strength in his words. One day Richard came to the office early. He wanted to finish preparing the reports before the next meeting with the sponsors. As he walked past the room where the foundation staff usually gathered for meetings, he overheard them talking. "I never thought he'd do so well," Helen said. "I was wrong about him," another staff member replied. "Yes, he's clearly not the kind of person who just sits still. He might actually be able to carry on Barbara's work." Richard froze. These words, spoken behind his back, meant more to him than he had expected. He felt that he was beginning to gain not only trust, but respect. That same day, Barbara suggested that he attend a charity event for the foundation. It was a big step. Now he had to speak in front of influential people and tell them about the work they were doing. "Are you ready, Richard?" she said, looking him carefully in the eye. "Don't doubt yourself. I believe you can do it." His journey was just beginning, but he could already feel himself changing. Now he wasn't just trying to survive, he was fighting to change the lives of others. But time was inexorably passing and Barbara's condition was getting worse and worse. She began to appear less frequently at the office and spent more time in her office at the mansion. Richard could see her strength draining away, but she continued to hold on. Tommy approached Richard one morning as he was preparing documents for a new meeting with the sponsors. "Richard," he began with noticeable caution, I think you need to talk to Barbara. Her condition has deteriorated. Perhaps she needs support. Richard froze, clutching the folder of papers in his hands. He already knew this was coming, but he wasn't prepared for this conversation. "Thank you, Tommy," he replied briefly and hurried to her room. He knocked and entered when he heard a quiet "come in." Barbara was sitting in a chair by the window. Her face was tired, but she still maintained her usual collected look. On the table beside her were books and a stack of letters. "Richard," she said, smiling, "how are things going at the foundation?" "It's fine," he replied, sitting down across from her. "But you shouldn't work so hard. Why don't you tell me when you're not feeling well?" She was silent for a moment, then looked at him with calm determination. "Because I don't have time to complain. My time is coming to an end. Richard knew that when he proposed to you. Knew I had to get the case into your hands in time." His heart clenched. He saw the pain in her eyes, but also the confidence. She believed in him more than he believed in himself. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "I'm here. We'll make it together." She smiled weakly, then pulled a small envelope from the drawer of her desk. "This is for you," she said, holding it out. "Read it when I can no longer explain it to you myself." Richard took the envelope, but in his heart he hoped that day would never come. A week later, Barbara was hospitalized. Richard tossed between the hospital, the foundation, and the mansion. At the foundation, he was beginning to be seen as a leader, not a student. But at home, at night, in the silence, he felt lost. Every time he visited Barbara, he promised her that everything would be all right. But one day, when he arrived at the hospital, her eyes were closed. The doctors said her condition was critical. Richard sat down beside her bed and took her cold hand. "I won't let you down," he said quietly. "You have given me a chance, and I will do everything I can to honor your trust." Barbara did not answer, but he thought she heard his words. Richard sat by Barbara's bedside, holding her hand. Her breathing was weak and her eyes were barely open, but she still had the strength to speak. "Richard," she whispered with difficulty, catching her breath, "you've become not just an heir to me, but a friend." His heart clenched. The words, spoken with such sincerity, came as a surprise to him. He wanted to say something in response, but he felt that any words now would not be strong enough. "You've taught me a lot," he said quietly, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I promise I will do everything I can to keep your business alive. You'll be proud of me." Her gaze softened, and a faint smile appeared on her lips. "I already am," she said. "You can do it. Eugene, remember, the main thing in our business is not money, but people. Help those who need it. And know that I have always believed in you." Eugene nodded, barely holding back tears. He watched her eyes slowly close and her breathing grow quieter and quieter. A heavy silence hung in the room. He sat by her side even as the doctors entered to pronounce death. His gaze was fixed on her calm face. Gone, but she had left him something far greater than wealth or status. She left him with meaning. After she left, Eugene sat in her office for a long time, surrounded by her books, letters, and documents. It seemed to him that her presence still hovered in the room. He remembered the envelope she had given him during their last conversation. Eugene opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written in her familiar, confident handwriting. "Dear Richard, if you are reading this letter, it means I have already left. But know that I left with a light heart because I have put my business in safe hands. You are the person in whom I saw what I was looking for: honesty, strength of spirit, and desire to help others. Don't be afraid of mistakes. They are inevitable. But every time you make a decision, remember why we do what we do. The foundation is not just a job. It is a tool that can change lives. Also, don't forget to live your life. You're young. You have a lot of opportunities ahead of you. Find happiness and don't be afraid to be happy. With love and faith in you, Barbara." Richard read the letter several times before folding it up and putting it away in his desk drawer. He felt a determination rising inside. He looked at the pictures of the children the foundation had helped and the papers with the current projects. This was his business now, and he vowed he wouldn't fail. It had been a year since Barbara's death. Richard continued her work with complete dedication. Under his leadership, the foundation not only maintained its position, but also began to develop, opening new areas of assistance, programs for orphans, support for poor families, educational grants. All of this has become part of his daily work. Deborah, now 9 years old, proudly told her school that her brother was helping people. She enrolled in the art school she had always dreamed of and often sent Richard new drawings. One of them, a bright landscape with green hills and a cozy house, hung on the wall of his office. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded of what he was working hard for. Richard spoke more and more often at charity events, telling the stories of those whom the foundation had already helped. His words inspired the donors, and each time he felt that he was fulfilling his mission. Ladies and gentlemen, he began his speech at one such event. We are not here to talk about numbers. We are here to talk about people. Children who have found families, students who have been educated, families who have found a roof over their heads. And it's all because of you. The hall erupted in applause. Richard paused and then added, "But you know what's most important? We're not just helping financially. We're giving hope. And I promise that our work will continue." After the event, Richard returned to his office, tired but satisfied. He switched on his desk lamp and began sorting through his papers. Among the papers, he found an old photograph of Barbara. It had been taken many years ago when the foundation had just started. Her gaze from the photograph was firm and confident, just as he remembered it in their last days. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, looking at the photograph. "I hope you're proud." That night, when he returned home, he found Deborah sitting at her desk. She was drawing a new picture. "What is it this time?" Richard smiled, peering over her shoulder. "This is our house," Deborah said, showing the picture. "I want us to have a garden like this and a big window to paint in." Richard nodded, looking at her work. "We're gonna make it, Deborah. We're going to make it." She looked at him and hugged him. "I know you will, Richard. You always make it through." Richard felt a warmth in his chest. He knew there was still a lot of work ahead, a lot of hardship, but he was no longer alone. He had Deborah, he had people who believed in him, and he had a mission he would never abandon.